Really, for us who are yet to adopt learning stories as a way of being with children and think deeply about it. One of the questions that I have heard from colleagues is regarding the age of the children and the responsibility of the teacher, and the fact that we're perceived in early childhood education to have a bit more freedom because we don't have the curriculum to teach, and can then the learning stories be used in grade 1 to 3 or grade 1 to 6? Is there age group that learning stories fit better than others, or what would you say to them?
I would say you can use learning stories at any age, quite frankly, and they are being used across the age groups. I think in the early days of learning stories, I remember people, what am I going to write about the baby? And this said a whole lot about where we were in our teaching, and our view of children and our image of the child. And now we get the most fabulous stories about babies and their learning lives, and deeply thoughtful, connected to learning. I don't think it's about, we now have schools who are using learning stories because, all the rhetoric about learning in the 21st century is not about the standards of literacy, mathematics, etc. Actually, learning in the 21st century is about those deep learning dispositions, those key competencies that they will carry with them throughout life. And you can't begin to actually tell the depth of children's learning in some checklist. If you're working with a 5 or a 6 or a 7-year-old, actually those children start writing their own learning stories. That's what's happening in schools. Yeah. But one of the things about learning stories, it has the capacity to carry the complexity of learning. So you're really able to engage in a much more complex, holistic view of learning rather than a very narrow frame. And that's one of the powers. But it's the power of transporting these ideas into families' lives. We all talk, and we know theoretically, we know the research, that if you can shift a parent's views about education, then you're helping this child for life. And if a parent is only basing it on their experience and they don't understand the power of learning in the 21st century, these children we are teaching today, it will be a very different world when they're in their early 20s, a very different world. They will need to be innovators, creators, communicators. Big picture stuff in terms of who they are. And I think that this capacity of learning stories to transmit these ideas to the child and to the family are very, very powerful, to engage the families in a conversation about learning. And that's what for instance, one of the early projects in a school, the teacher in the new entrance class with the 5-year-old started doing learning stories, and she was very excited. She went to the principal, and the principal said, okay, you can introduce this to the school, and after a year, if you think that this is something that we could use across the whole primary school, then we'll go for it. And that's what happened. They discovered, the teacher said, oh my goodness, we're discovering we're having a conversation with these parents about learning, and it's changed our relationships with parents. The principal said, righto, we'll get rid of the first and second reporting, which is just a figure, and we'll leave the last reporting, but we will use learning stories right through the year to engage families in this conversation about education. But it's not just in school. We've been working quite a lot in Germany over the years. So some of the people that we've worked with have now retired, and actually they're now working with refugees at this time in quite spectacular ways. And Isolde, one of the women we've worked with, she started working with refugees, but she noticed that they, as capable as they were and as amazing as their language growth had been in terms of learning German, they were not getting jobs. So she started writing learning stories about the refugees, and they started getting jobs. So It's the power of story.
Story. Yeah.
To transfer and transmit information in this very positive way, which I think is the key.
Absolutely.
I am now going to share 5 learning stories. These learning stories will represent a range of ages from infants through schooling and finally sharing a story written for a young man who was a refugee in Germany. I have no doubt that these stories will answer the question, what is the best age for learning stories to be used? It is now clear that learning stories are being used across the globe in a wide range of age groups, deeply embedded in each culture and in their own context. Over time, children and adults are both the recipients and authors of learning stories, shared both individually and collectively, shaping their identities over time. Teachers, for example, are writing learning stories for their colleagues and celebrating their learner identities. Parents are writing learning stories to share their lives with their children. I hope the learning stories I am sharing will give you a sense of the possibilities. Karen Hose is the author of this learning story and teaches at the Greaton Early Learning Centre in Tauranga. As Lorraine writes, Karen is one of the wisest women I know. For 20 years, she has been a most kind-hearted, thoughtful mentor to us all. Our children love her beyond measure. Our families trust her implicitly because she is trustworthy and will walk that extra journey to ensure children are cared for. I've known her to give up morning and afternoon tea, forego lunch, and then stay till the end of the day during transition processes to ensure our Pepe, our babies, stay happy and she can connect with the whānau at both ends of the day. The way her colleagues seek her advice, the way they value her opinion, and the way we have all learnt from her practice is testament to her 20 years at Greaton that we have all unquantifiably valued. Karen has always given an advocacy voice for Pepe, who cannot voice their perspectives, wrapping learning and love together so that babies can thrive has been her driving values. This is what the learning story looks like in the portfolio. I will now read the learning story. It's titled The Tree by Karen Hose. Arthur lay under the tree with his friend Hazel. The leaves moved in the slight breeze. His mindful gaze was captivated by the tree. Hazel, lying beside him, was intent on engaging Arthur's attention, but Arthur was intrigued by the tree. Hazel was disappointed by Arthur's lack of attention, so together we lay on our backs, just like Arthur, looking up into the tree to find out for ourselves what Arthur was studying. We discovered that in doing this, your body first must relax. Together, like Arthur, our bodies stopped fidgeting and we too became enveloped under an umbrella of leaves. I felt totally wrapped within the tree and began to notice the movement of the leaves and the filtered light that shone through the gaps in the branches and leaves. The colour of the leaves changed with the amount of light they received, and just like magic, I too was caught under the tree's spell. This was a very empowering moment for Hazel and me, for we could see that Arthur was not just a quiet baby with nothing much going on, but a person feeling, observing, listening, thinking, engaging, and finding real knowledge about his world. Magda Gerber describes beautifully what Arthur is doing in these quiet times. Quote, "An infant is constructing a worldview based upon input actively elicited from people and things around her, with downtime for the integration of new learning," unquote. Hazel and I learned that there is so much more we can learn from Arthur if we take the time to really listen. As Magda Gerber says, be careful what you teach. It might interfere with what they are learning. Karen Fowler is the author of the next 2 learning stories and teaches at the Te Puke Primary School. Karen says that Te Whāriki lays the foundation for all that she does in their Curious Kiwi classroom. This classroom is a space where relationships are valued and nurtured, children are empowered, and learning happens in every moment as children make choices about how and where they will learn. As Karen states, this often looks and sounds like play. In her classroom, teachers, whānau and children are being challenged to see learning through the lens of Te Whāriki, with the benefit of knowledge that comes from neuroscience research and understandings around how children learn best. Karen believes learning stories have been a valuable tool to engage the learning community and to make the valued learning visible to all. Karen goes on to say that using learning stories allows her to highlight the important learning she sees happening all around them, as the wonderful, creative, thoughtful and powerful children, tamariki, drive their own learning, make discoveries and construct working theories about the world around them. This learning story is titled Joyful Bubbles. Te wairere, it was so lovely to watch you joyfully explore these bubbles today. What a lot of fun you were having as you learnt more about the natural world. He taonga te mokopuna, kia whāngaia, kia tipu, kia rea. A child is a treasure to be nurtured, to grow, to flourish. My thoughts on this learning. As I watched you explore with such delight, I could see that you were indeed being nurtured to grow and flourish. I can see you are capable and competent, eager to explore and make sense of the world you live in. The New Zealand curriculum, Science Level 1 and 2, expects that students will extend their experiences and personal explanations of the natural world through exploration, play, asking questions and discussing simple models. Exploring these intriguing bubbles allowed you to become a scientist at play and build working theories about the world around you. How might this learning continue to grow? Te wairere, there are lots of opportunities for you to explore the natural world every day in the Curious Kiwis classroom. I wonder what other sorts of intriguing natural world experiences you might be interested in. Ice, gloop, bugs, mud. Written by Fire Karen. This is a second story written from Karen's classroom, and it is titled Cody's Robot. Cody, you were working on some maths tasks with me, practicing some of our foundation skills. You are still learning lots of things like how to make a repeating pattern and what is more, less, and the same looks like. As we practiced these ideas with the Cuisenaire rods, you came up with your own innovative idea. Look at the cool robot you made. My thoughts on your learning. Cody, we are seeing so much growth in your learning power as you continue to stretch your ability to participate and contribute in our classroom. You are developing a can-do attitude and you are willing to give new learning a go, even when it's tricky. Cody, I think you are an innovative thinker. I love the way our maths learning became creative and expressive. For you to be a strong, lifelong maths learner, it is important for you to view maths as something that is relevant and meaningful to you, something you can play with that helps you organize and plan your world and communicate with others. Making a robot was your way of trying to make sense of these mathematical ideas. So, how might this learning continue to grow? Cody, you went on to practice writing the numbers 1 to 5. This was a challenge for you, but again, you had a can-do attitude and gave it a go. Keep on taking on learning challenges, Cody. As you practice and practice, your learning will grow. Jo Aitken is the author of the next learning story and was the associate principal at Northcote Primary School at the time of writing the story. Prior to arriving at Northcote Primary School, Jo worked in an early childhood centre for a year on arrival from England. Here she witnessed the work of learning stories and participated in writing them. At this time, she was not sure if they would work for primary schools. And when the opportunity came, she decided to give Learning Stories a Go in primary school and was delighted at the response. After trialling it in the junior department, the teachers all agreed to use Learning Stories across the whole school with professional development support. And what happened was Learning Stories opened up lines of communication, and the teachers got to know the children and families better. They discovered that they were talking with parents and not at parents, and it was now a continuous conversation about learning via these learning stories. As Jo states, children began revisiting their learning, and the impact was monumental. Her words, she felt it was amazing. Jo would share the learning story with the child individually, then their story with the whole class, and the child would be so proud. She says, as she told the learning story to the class, their little chest would just puff out with pride. Teachers also found that children in older classes were more motivated, more responsible, and engaging with their learning. Also, the older classes, some children were actually writing learning stories about other children. The culture of the school changed. The teachers were more reflective. The learning stories helped them to engage with the children and helped them to discover what the children wanted to learn about. Jo believed that using the learning stories, the classroom was more powerful, as this closer connection enabled the teachers to understand what engages children and what motivates the children to learn. This is what the learning story looks like in the child's portfolio, and this one is entitled Little Miss Scientist. I will now read the story. What a great day we all had at Science Alive. Firstly, we had a chance to do some experiments in the classroom, and then we went through to the interactive area. Leilani, I noticed that you were keen to take part in all the experiments and that you were able to answer some tricky questions about floating and sinking, solids and liquids, gases and dissolving. You followed the instructions carefully when you were asked to do something by the parent helpers and thought about what you had observed before sharing it with others. What does this tell me? This tells me that you are actively involved in your learning and that you are motivated to participate in all activities. You worked really well with the other children. I was impressed with the great thinking skills you used and how you used your stop and think habit of mind to answer questions confidently. Well done, Leilani. Where to next? I can tell that you are curious about the world around you and that you are keen to learn more. You might be able to find some interesting books in the library to look at. We will be doing some more science topics and experiments during the year, so I look forward to hearing you share your great ideas again. And now we have Leilani's voice. She says, I had fun at Science Live. And then her parents respond to the question, did Leilani tell you about our visit to the Science Alive? And her parent responds, yes, Leilani did tell us about the Science Alive trip in great detail, and she told everybody who came to visit our home about the trip too. Leilani loves Science Alive and always asks to visit if we are driving past or wanting to have a day trip out. Leilani is very curious about the world and how things work. Isolde Koch is the author of The Next Learning Story and has taught educators in Germany for many years. She is now a volunteer in a refugee camp. Since 2006, Isolde has been inspired by learning stories. She was a teacher-educator for 30 years until 2009, and in the last 3 years of her teaching career, she started spreading learning stories in her teacher education setting. Isolde says that was the best time during her professional life, and this was due to the power of learning stories. When Isolde retired, she still had learning stories in her mind. She worked as a volunteer in a refugee camp with about 50 men from Eritrea, Syria and Somalia. These capable men were adjusting to life in Germany, learning the German language, but finding it challenging to win jobs. Isolde began to think, why not write learning stories for them? And this had powerful consequences, and the refugees began having success winning jobs. Suffice to say that Isolde's passion for New Zealand, Aotearoa, and in particular Te Whāriki is without question. And this is an image of her living room where she has created a beautiful painting of the Te Whāriki weave. This is a visual image of Isolde's learning story. Dear Disbelle, in April 2015, when I went into your mobile home just to find out how refugees live in my neighbourhood, you were the one who moved me to stay. You were a small group of 7 young men from Eritrea, and Sibylla was your volunteer teacher. She taught you the first German words, and you allowed me to participate in the lesson. After this lesson, I decided to teach another group of men from the camp. 6 other men and I arranged to meet a few days later. But the men were not there when I came to the camp for my first lesson with them. I was disappointed and somehow felt rejected and was determined to go home. I was already on my way out when I saw you, again with 6 young other Eritreans, waving and showing me the way to the classroom. There on the blackboard I could read, "Welkom, Mama Isolde." I felt adopted by you instantly, only by one word in my language, and I could not resist your friendly, laughing faces. I must confess that until then I went to your home more with fear than with curiosity. You wiped my fear away at that moment. I remember that I had to laugh spontaneously. That was a great moment. I will never forget it. It was you, Disbelle, who wrote these words. I immediately admired your ability to communicate in such a simple way whatever you wanted. You wanted more lessons for you and your fellow countrymen, and so we started our first lesson, and it was a joy. Later this teaching changed from just learning German to learning German and origami, and our lessons were a chance for you to forget your grief and sorrow for a while. You always use your skills to create connections, as you did in the camp when we met. By now you've become so skilled and that you accompany your compatriots when they need advice and translation at the immigration office, and by now you know the legal rights of refugees better than most Germans do. You lived in the camp only for a few months because a student flat wanted you as their roommate. They have chosen you, and you fit very well in this group of 2 men and 2 women. You've got a room of your own, and there you are studying the German language, often without a tutorial. I know that requires determination, discipline, and concentration. One day I asked you to translate a document from me from English to Tigrinya, your language, and I learned how focused you can be. I sat by your side and you worked silently and steadily. I wanted to ask you a question, but to my surprise, you did not let me interfere. I liked that very much, and I did not repeat my question until you had finished your work. We talk almost exclusively in German. We talk about the political situation, also about the Germans and the refugees, and about articles in the newspapers or about television news. I admire your ability to assume different points of view and to find the right words in the German language. This map shows the way in which you travelled from Eritrea. This is the way another Eritrean man travelled to Europe, and it's so similar to your trip. What I like most is that we even tell jokes and laugh together about funny situations. With you, it's wonderfully easy to see the humorous side of everyday situations. Because you have learned so determinedly well, we can talk in my language. I am not able to speak one word in your language. Perhaps one day you will teach me some of your language and your alphabet. How you have changed in only 1 year. How fast you have learnt German. Welcome, Disbelle Isolde. Annie's work with students at the university is significant in terms of learning stories. One very special part of her work has been the development of her work around My Stories. This project has a focus on honouring student voices at the university and using learning stories as a tool for self-reflection. My Stories is a process where students identify and share their social and cultural identities, represented through various art modalities, and she shares the impact it has on relationships and students' multiple identities. Annie's research illustrated how learning stories strengthened students' developing sense of self, identity as a learner, and valued community member. Learning Stories has positively influenced assessment practices in the USA and creates deeper, caring relationships among students. I am hopeful that in the not-too-distant future, Dr. Annie White will contribute a webinar to share the work of My Stories with you all. Janina Martin works for Catholic Charities in Hawaii and has been involved in using learning stories in a therapeutic program. Kupuna Tokamali'i is a cutting-edge therapeutic program and is federally funded through the Victims of Crime Act and services the population along the leeward coast of Oahu Island of Hawaii. It was designed to include taking a talk story approach to therapeutic interventions, honouring the culture from which the participants come, and gathering stories that are important to the strengthening of individuals and relationships within the community at large. Learning stories have been utilised as one approach in this sub-project and has been found to be a good fit with the intent towards building rapport and reflecting back to participants their innate wisdoms, strengths and aptitudes. This exploration of writing learning stories to participants has borne out a new way of thinking about therapy and the interplay between therapist and client. Write stories that make a difference. Recognise the privilege it is to enter children's and other adults' lives in this way. This is the trace of your professional life. Write with passion, with curiosity, determination and joy. Whether you are writing a learning story to gift to a colleague about their professional life or a child, this contribution will be significant and will hold a special power. I know there are thousands of learning stories that are held close to the hearts and minds of many and are giving joy each time that they are read and reread. Take pleasure and enjoy the experience. If you're interested in pursuing some more in-depth information about learning stories, I'd like to suggest you start with the Green Book, Learning Stories in Practice, which will give you a very practical view of learning stories and a good overview. For those who want a more in-depth look, the second book, Learning Stories, Constructing Learner Identities in Early Education, would be very useful, I am sure. We do have a private Facebook page on Learning Stories assessment. So for those of you who would like to participate in this, you are more than welcome to join the group to continue the conversation on learning stories. Thanks for watching.